Americans of all races love our country, and a doctrine that's grounded in hatred of our country is eventually going to just grate to the point where people will reject it.
My guest today is Dr. Peter Wood. Dr. Wood is president of the National Association of Scholars. In 2019, he received the Jeane Kirkpatrick Prize for contributions to academic freedom. Dr. Wood's recent book, 1620, A Critical Response to the 1690 Project, exposes the jumble of lies, half-lies, logical fallacies, bad history, and bad faith of a project motivated by greed and hatred of America. It also tells a false story about capitalism. In seeking to debunk American principles, the 1619 authors were led to ignore history, to disregard some of its most moving and revealing aspects. I recently sat down with Dr. Wood and talked about the 1619 Project and how dangerous it really is. All right, Dr. Peter Wood, thanks so much for agreeing to be on the show. I'm really excited what you have to say because your book, I briefed through it over the past couple of days, and really great stuff that you have in there. So let's get right to it.
Well, thank you for having me on.
Okay, make believe I fell from Mars, and I have no idea what the 1619 Project is. How would you explain it to someone living in America today that has no idea what's going on?
Well, in 2019, America's so-called newspaper of record, its most important lead news source for the whole country, devoted a whole issue of its Sunday magazine to what it called the 1619 Project. That's where the term comes from. And that 1619 Project was a very somber declaration accompanied by a black and white picture of an empty ocean on the cover, saying that 400 years earlier, in August of 1619, a slave ship had arrived off the coast of Jamestown, Virginia, and onboarded 20-some black African slaves who were then the beginning of what the authors call the slavocracy that would one day become the United States. This is a positive assertion that something happened and that it had consequences. It was also a negative assertion that other things hadn't happened. So the 1619 Project is a loud, vigorous declaration that the American ideals of freedom and equality are a sham. They never had any real presence at all. They just were an attempt to cover up the expropriation of the labor of African slaves and the suppression of their rights. And that what began in August of 1619 continues with variations to this very day, that America needs to be understood as a nation that was founded in and continues to be illegitimate because it is based on the theft of labor and freedom from Africans.
Okay. I went to school and I learned that really the birthday of this country is July 4th, 1776. Declaration of Independence is signed, and history starts there as a nation. And the 1619 Project basically says, whoa, way off. History started 150 or so years prior with an African slave ship coming to these shores. Do I have that right?
Well, that's the claim that the New York Times was making. There's a lot of things I could say about it. One of them is that the New York Times is a newspaper that is supposedly reporting news. In this case, it took on the task of inventing history. And I use the word inventing there carefully, in that it's not telling a history that wasn't previously known, but it is reframing, that's their word, all of American history through this one particular supposed event. And you wouldn't have been wrong to think that the nation of the United States began on July 4th, 1776. And the authors of the report, the principal author is a woman named Nicole Hannah-Jones, is ready to dispute that. According to Hannah-Jones, what happened in 1776 is that the English colonists in North America became alarmed that the British would abolish slavery, take their slaves away, and create freedom. And they were so afraid this might happen that they decided that they would rebel so as to preserve slavery. So what happened in 1776, in other words, is just more of the same. It's just an effort to keep the slave system going. Now, I don't want to just leave those words lying there as though they might be true, because they're not one bit true. And it can take this apart in a lot of ways. I think it's useful to first recognize that what happened way back in Jamestown in 1619 isn't exactly what Nicole Hannah-Jones and her fellow contributors said. Indeed, a ship arrived off the coast there. It was a pirate ship, English pirates who had intercepted a Spanish convoy of ships in the Caribbean headed towards Mexico with slaves destined for the mines in Mexico. They captured a bunch of the slaves. They sold some of them in Bermuda. And then those that had left over, 20 some, we don't know the exact number, they brought north to Jamestown, by which point the pirates had run out of food and were willing to trade their slaves for food. Some people in Jamestown took the offer, but Jamestown did not recognize the existence of slavery. So when these African captives were taken off the Golden Lion, the White Lion was the name of the ship, they became indentured servants. Well, being an indentured servant is not necessarily a great thing, especially if you're not volunteering for that task, but it's generally a lot better than being a slave, because an indentured servant serves a term. In English law, it was usually 7 years, after which you're set free, which is exactly what happened to these particular captives. They became free after a period of time. We know what happened to some of them because they became landowners. They intermarried with the white population. They had full legal rights, as we know, because in some cases there were court cases where they sued their neighbors and won. So this was not really the instance of the beginning of slavery in the English colonies in North America at all.
Right.
That wasn't
okay.
what happened.
So Peter, let me just jump in here for a second. It sounds like these are a newspaper comes up with a new history of the United States, starting it in 1619 as opposed to 1776. They have a whole bunch of people write stuff. Are these people scholars? Do they have any sources for this, or they just pick this in order? They had the conclusion they were just trying to find the facts.
Well, my guess is that that's what happened, but what we do know is that that magazine supplement, the 1619 Project, had 10 major essays. 8 of those 10 essays were written by people who were not historians. Most of them were journalists. None of them cite sources. So we get these stories presented as just so stories. This is what happens, they said. They don't tell you on what basis they think they know those things happened. And we're left then with this kind of very authoritative sounding account of American history, with nothing like a historian's care for presenting the facts or noting where we don't know things or where the evidence is ambiguous. It's just sort of straight laid out there as an account, a narrative of America's past.
Okay, so hang on one second. So now you totally threw me for a loop. So you have a newspaper with 10 journalists not citing any footnotes, coming up with some sort of narrative that they found, created, or what have you. and rewriting the history of the United States. And you are a professor of anthropology. You're the president of the National Association of Scholars. So you have I would say, a couple of credits to your name of knowing what you're talking about. And why is anyone listening, or let me rephrase the question, why do I care what the New York Times put out as quote unquote history by 10 or so journalists without citing any citations or footnotes?
Well, I cared because I know the New York Times has credibility, and this sounded to me like something that was going to get some attention. So right away, I got busy looking more closely at the assertions and inviting other historians in to talk about it. But there's another reason to care, which is that New York Times is a fairly wealthy organization, and it decided to put a lot of resources behind promoting this. This wasn't a once and done magazine that ran in August during the slow months of the year. It was the beginning of an effort to create a curriculum in America's schools. The last page of the magazine was a statement from the Pulitzer Center saying that they partnered with the New York Times and were turning these essays into a curriculum that would be suitable for every grade level in America's schools. They moved very quickly on that. Within a few months, they had signed up major school districts like Buffalo and Chicago. They had signed up thousands of teachers, now tens of thousands, and we're bringing this into our schools. Now, some immediate alarms about that, which is that changing the curriculum in the schools is usually something that gets a fair amount of public oversight. We have school boards and commissions in the various state bureaucracies, and the public has a lot to say about this as well. This bypassed all those safeguards and simply became a set of modules that the teachers could pick up and plug into their courses without any oversight. The Times didn't stop there. It produced a lavish and rather beautiful minute-long television advertisement, the first time in that newspaper's history they had done something like this. And they ran that advertisement in the Super Bowl and in the Oscar Awards. They were willing to spend a lot of money to get a lot of attention. The newspaper itself, over a period of many months, ran full-page advertisements for their own projects. Sometimes they were 2 pages. So no expense was spared, and that continues. Right now they offer fellowships and grants to teachers who are willing to adopt the project and to promote it to fellow teachers. The Pulitzer Center continues to be in it neck deep as something to be promoted. I think that the advertising campaign has to be looked at as part of the reason why Nicole Hannah-Jones, the principal author of this thing, got the Pulitzer Prize in June of 2020. So it has spread. I mean, why pay attention? If it were just one newspaper with a fanciful story about America's past, that would be bad enough. But it's gone beyond being that to being something that plays a pretty big role in our public life right now. Now, you mentioned I'm the head of the National Association of Scholars. We've been resisting the rise of the 1619 curriculum, which has ties now to things like Ibram X. Kendi's version of anti-racism, to the critical race theory, to the idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Okay, hang one second. I'm not getting this, and forgive me. I'm not a scholar. I definitely am not even close to a historian. But here's what I'm not getting. They come out, the New York Times, a newspaper, with a, I don't know, anecdotal or revisionist or narrative that this country really started based on racism from 1619. Journalists, not historians, citing no sources, no footnotes, no citations. And you're telling me now tens of thousands of teachers and school boards and school districts have adopted this so-called history into the classrooms to teach our kids? Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly what I'm saying. The number of school boards, I have no idea. I do know, for example, that a friend of mine who is himself a historian, wrote to every school superintendent in the state of Connecticut saying, you really shouldn't adopt this. And that was something like 180 different districts. Only 2 of them responded, and or responded in a positive way. It seems that the, what do you call it, professional educator class, the people who run our schools, and in many cases the school boards, are pretty eager to adopt the 1619 project. And that's a good thing to have a conversation about, to try to understand why something that is so factually false, that's broken in its pieces, would appeal to the people we charge with educating our children. And I should add, I'm far from alone in thinking this is a bad idea. From the get-go, professional historians were coming forward and saying significant mistakes here, and you have to fix them. And the historians who were coming forward weren't all conservatives. Most of them were actually pretty liberal, and they made their best case to the New York Times, you've got to fix these mistakes. The Times just flatly refused to do that. So we are dealing with a falsification of American history, not just a alternative narrative or a new interpretation, but something that we know is just not so.
Okay, so let me ask you this. If tomorrow morning the New York Times comes up with a new project where the Flat Earth Society, and they have 10 journalists not citing citations, not citing any scientific facts, come out and with this beautiful glossy curriculum and try to get into our schools to say, look, everything that we've been learning is really wrong. The Earth is the center of the universe. In fact, the Earth is even flat. Everything was different. How would scholars, teachers, I don't even put teachers in that, how would school boards, educators, how would they deal with that? Forget about the 1690 project. What do you think? Or I'm just an average guy. What would you think they would respond to that?
I think they would take it as an April Fool's joke. They would laugh at it and just say, "Oh, never mind." The reason being that in something like whether the Earth is going around the sun or the sun around the Earth, people have a pretty basic level of scientific literacy, and there are lots of subjects in which we would let our better knowledge prevail. It doesn't in this case, and that's for a reason, and the reason takes us back to what happened in 2020 and in years before that, when the post-George Floyd riots broke out in many cities and buildings were burned and people were killed. Nicole Hannah-Jones said these are the 1619 riots. When statues were being toppled, George Washington on his face, so forth, spray painted on the base of those statues was 1619. What happened was that the 1619 project fit in beautifully with the idea that this was a new era in which racial resentment could be unleashed, that ideas such as the one that there's implicit racism everywhere, that we're a systemically racist society, had to be met with some kind of response. And among educators, the response tended to be one of kind of abject capitulation. Rather than pushing back, are we really a systemically racist society? educators, by and large, made declarations that, yes, indeed, we are. If that's what you believe to be the case, or more or less, then something like the 1619 Project makes sense. This is a way of atonement for all the bad things that America did to people of African ancestry. And who cares if it's not exactly right? It feels morally right. It feels good to be able to say we're doing something to make up for centuries of enslavement and denial of civil rights. What we're doing now is teaching the 1619 Project. So the 1619 Project arrived at the right moment. It arrived at a moment when educators, many of them white, were ready to say, absolutely, we need to do something to fix the problem. What have we got? And they looked in their drawers, and what they had was the 1619 Project. So I think what's happened here is that this was a kind of match thrown into the tinderbox. We have a world now where there are a lot of educated or semi-educated people who believe that it's really, really, really important to atone for slavery. And the way to do that is to tell this new fairy tale, this fable. By calling it a fairy tale, I'm not really doing it justice. It's much worse than that. This eradicates the basis for our common citizenship in this country.
Right.
How do you?
No, go ahead. How do you?
How do you have a country in which you bring up a generation of children to hate it, to view our past as nothing but cause for shame and disgrace, and to view even the present as so riddled with racial animus and hatred that we can't possibly get along with each other? This is a 1619 Project, is a cleaver that tries to put a permanent division between the races, and to say that the right way to proceed is through profound resentment, through anger, and through reparations. And,
okay, so now this isn't this isn't bad history. This isn't mistakes. This isn't scholars debating. This is just a catalyst, or not even a catalyst. This really is just feeding upon a present feeling among some that this country is a racist, terrible place. And the conclusion was already drawn, and now we're going to create a history, if you will, and I put that in quotes, with supplying facts that aren't facts, just fantasy. Is that more or less what this is?
Yes, that's exactly what it is. This is a fantasy. Now, I mean, I don't want to just throw a word at it. I think to say it's a fantasy, I should say at least a little bit about what's in that fantasy. We've already mentioned 1776 and the American Revolution, which is falsely made out to be an effort to maintain slavery. A few more words about that. Slavery existed in most of the states that were going to become the United States at that time, but so did an abolition movement. Right. The abolitionist movement had already started in New England in that period. So by the time the American Revolution broke out, there were quite a few Americans who thought slavery was bad. There were no Americans who thought that England was about to intervene and end slavery. That is because England had a huge financial stake in continuing slavery. They were the biggest slave trader in the world, bringing large numbers of slaves over to supply their sugar plantations in the Caribbean. And they were supplying slaves to the southern states in America.
Okay.
Pretty much.
Hang on a second, Dr. Wood. So you're basically telling me the men who signed the Declaration of Independence and who risked their lives by signing a treasonous document, because that's what the Declaration was, right? You were still under England, and anyone who signed that, as Ben Franklin said, we all hang together, we all hang separate. They risked their lives to sign this because, and I'm just trying to understand what the 1619 Project is because they wanted to perpetuate slavery in this new world, in this new country that we're founding. Is that yes or no?
Yes, that's exactly what Nikole Hannah-Jones says. That's the reason why the colonists rebelled was to maintain slavery.
Okay, so
it's flat out not true. And the not trueness of it is that we know why the American colonies rebelled. They told us so in the Declaration of Independence. It lays out a whole bunch of reasons. That reason isn't among them. So maybe they had that reason and were hiding it. Well, you would think then it would show up someplace else, maybe in colonial newspapers. All the colonial newspapers have been scoured. It's not in there. How about private letters, people's diaries? Never mentioned. So this is something where if you wanted to find evidence to support it,
there isn't any.
There are places you could look, but there isn't any. There just isn't any.
Okay, let me go through history with you because this sounds... I knew very little about the 1619 Project. All that I knew, it seemed to me just a jumble of a lot of BS thrown together to prove a point. I didn't know how dangerous it is and how much it's not, I shouldn't say seeping, it's really like a tsunami into the educational system. So I just want to go through a couple of things with you. Abraham Lincoln, what he did to save the Union and to the emancipation and the soldiers from the North and South. And we have many letters between Northern and the Southerners during that war, talking about fighting in order to free slaves. All bunk?
No, that's exactly what happened. There were two main motives for the North in the Civil War. One was to maintain the Union, and the other was to free the slaves. And both those things are true, but what's not true is what the New York Times puts forward, which was the idea that Lincoln pursued the Civil War in order to exile the slaves outside continental United States, send them someplace else, to Haiti, to Panama, maybe to Africa. Now, there is this to say for that back way in the beginning of the 19th century, the abolitionist movement was trying to figure out how to help ex-slaves. And their notion at that point was, well, maybe we can repatriate people back to Africa. That's where the colony of Liberia came from. Lincoln grew up with that idea all around him. There were many well-meaning people who thought the best we can do to get rid of slavery would be to create repatriation instead. During the Civil War, at one point, Lincoln met with a delegation of Black leaders in Washington, D.C., in which he mentioned this idea. It actually was taken over by the delegation who thought it was a pretty good idea, and they said they would support it. But Lincoln himself said, no, that's not what I want to do, and he quickly backed away from it. Nikole Hannah-Jones knew about that one afternoon meeting at the White House in which Lincoln said these things. She took that to be Lincoln's real reason for fighting the Civil War. Everything else was just a mask. What he really wanted to do was get rid of the Black people in the United States.
Okay. So wait, let me go even further. So the letters between the Union Army soldiers and many times, in many cases, their family members who were fighting in the South. We have many letters that go back and forth, and you read about the fervor that many of these Northerners, these Union soldiers, felt that they were doing God's work by freeing the slaves. All that was bunk as well. That's how does she address that?
She doesn't address it. She has a high capacity to ignore any evidence that doesn't fit with her thesis. So we learn that Lincoln was a racist. We don't really learn about the hundreds of thousands of soldiers who thought that they were fighting to liberate slaves. But we do know that they were racist too, because they were white and they were part of this system which continued oppression even after the end of slavery. We just went into slavery in another form.
Okay, so let me move forward. 1964, LBJ, civil rights, the most I don't know, this most amazing document for African Americans since the emancipation. What about that? LBJ was doing what? What was President Johnson doing with the Civil Rights Bill? That was also a sham?
It was just another cover-up for white supremacy. The idea was that, yeah, we can pretend to respect the rights and liberties of African Americans, but we don't really have to do that because we have so arranged the American economy, even our interstate highway system, our medical systems, in every imaginable way. Discrimination is now thoroughly baked into the American system. So creating the illusion of civil rights is fine. We won't really have to change anything.
All right, I just want to tell, for those listening to the podcast, Dr. Wood is a pretty serious guy, but every now and then the corner of his mouth just curves into a smile because he can't believe what he's actually saying. Now he's actually laughing. This is becoming even funny to me. If it wasn't so serious, I would be laughing as well. Next for you, 1954, Brown versus Board of Education. Eisenhower sends in troops so black children could go to a white school to integrate schools. Sham as well. That was what? More cover-up? More white supremacy?
Yeah, white supremacy is a supremely clever system that knows when it should fall back just a tiny bit to give people the illusion that they are being respected and treated fairly. So Brown versus the Board of Education ends legal segregation, but we know that most blacks are going to be confined to crummy inner city schools and not get any real education anyway.
This was just a ruse. This was just a ruse in order. This is the white man being so clever that throughout history they find these points in order to make it seem like they really care, but between us, they really don't. Is that right?
That's right. Now, Nicole Hannah-Jones has a nice way to frame all this. She says every advance in civil rights was achieved solely by the efforts of black people helping themselves. So you know right away that when LBJ or some other white person is on the side of advancing civil rights, he's up to something mischievous. It isn't real. Because the real advances only come from black people helping themselves.
Okay, so Robert Weaver, the first African-American to hold a cabinet position, he's appointed Secretary of Housing and Urban Development by LBJ, by Lyndon Baines Johnson, 1966. Also a sham. He helped himself into that position, or the white man was helping him once again just to cover up?
Well, she doesn't specifically address that, but I mean, I understand the project's logic well enough to know that he may have thought he was being a successful black man advancing the cause of black civil rights, but he was really just window dressing for the racist system that was all around him.
Got it. Okay, let's even get even better. So Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice, Secretary of State. If anyone knows anything about history, and I think I still know a little bit, the Secretary of State is in the succession plan of the presidency, right? So when these two African Americans were placed by a Republican president into these positions of power, this was also a sham as well.
Of course, it had to be. I mean, we know that white people don't give up power or share it without some clever reason of their own.
Got it. All right, so let's keep going. Barack Obama becoming president in 2008. Two terms. Tell me about that again.
Well, of course, he was elected with the wholehearted support of the black community. That was self-help, and that they were able to bring some white voters along too. Well, that was nice, but what really happened with Barack Obama was that he was someone who was championed by the black community. But by the way, he never really lived up to that. He once in office didn't deliver the goods the way he should have.
Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris. What about her? That was another joke?
Well, Kamala Harris is kind of a hard case. She's not African American. She's
No, but don't
part
tell
Indian.
anyone that. Don't tell anyone she's half Jamaican and half Indian, because that's not true. She's the same way Barack Obama was. I don't think anyone ever saw Barack Obama's mother in anything. She was white, and it didn't fit the narrative. Did you ever see her campaign? Did you ever see her anywhere during his 8 years?
Not at all. I think she disappeared. I don't actually know what happened to her. Is she alive?
I don't know. I hope she is. But Kamala Harris, who was so proud to be the first Indian senator from India, now she's not African American. She's Jamaican American, half Jamaican American, half Indian. And according to this new narrative, the 1619 Project, she's not a real African American, therefore doesn't count. Is that right?
Well, I think that raises a good question. About 7 months after the 1619 Project was published, Nicole Hannah-Jones went back into the New York Times Magazine with a follow-on essay titled "What is Owed?" And it's an account of why America should pay reparations in the many billions of dollars to the descendants of people who were enslaved in America. Well, of course, that would leave out someone like our vice president, whose ancestors may have included slaves in Jamaica. Probably that's true, but those were not slaves in America, and I'm not sure why we would be paying reparations for people who were enslaved in another continent, another country, another place. So there's that difficult issue. The same thing would be true of Barack Obama, who, to the extent that he's part African, his father was never enslaved. He was from Kenya, from the Luo tribe. And so there are and have been quite a few million African Americans who came to this country voluntarily after the end of slavery, high immigration from Africa, even in the early decades of the 20th century. So if we're going to pursue the line of reparations, we've got this very curious historical difficulty to unravel, which is that there are a lot of Americans who don't think of themselves as Black or African American, who do have ancestors who were enslaved. We have lots of other African Americans who have no connection to antebellum slavery in the South. So one would have to be prepared to undertake an immense genealogical study and examination of historical records to carry through what Nicole Hannah-Jones now tells us was the real purpose of the 1619 Project, namely that she did it in order to create a movement that would lead to the payment of racial reparations to the descendants of slaves. Really kind of fascinating in that you probably couldn't do it if you wanted to. Why we would want to is something else. Along those lines, what we have in the 1619 Project is a blame game. It's attempting to say that every dissatisfaction and unhappiness that African Americans today experience can be traced back to the years in which Blacks in this country were enslaved. Now, those years roughly go from the 1670s through emancipation in 1865. But many of the things which weigh on the lives and welfare of today's African American community really have nothing to do with slavery. They have to do with the unfortunate consequences of the Great Society program, which just plain broke the African American family and created generations of kids who grew up with parents who were not married to each other. The breakdown of our social institutions in the cities has a lot more to do with the politics and the economics of the last half century than it does with what happened a century and a half ago. And that requires a certain willingness to forget, or to at least pay no attention to actual history.
So let me ask you a question. How does she deal with successful African Americans who've achieved amazing things in the world of finance, in the world of scholarship, in the academia? How does she deal with all the oppression and racism, that the so-called racism, the systemic racism? How does she, and the House of Representatives and the Senate, and some of the people we've just mentioned who served in the cabinet, how does she deal with all of that? Those are aberrations?
Well, she basically doesn't deal with it. That's one of those collection of awkward facts that doesn't fit her scheme of things. But I'll impose my own extension of how she views the world on this. I don't think I could back this up by citing particular sentences from her writing, but her view is that the racism of American society is so deep and so profound that we don't see it, and there are ambitious, talented blacks who overcome it and achieve things despite the oppression that's all around them. But their achievements don't negate the oppression. It's still there. No matter how successful you might be as a black woman, you may walk into a department store and have clerks look at you as a potential shoplifter, and that's racism. And everybody feels the sting of it. It's demeaning. It's that sense that people don't trust you, or that people look down on you. And that is not something that's going to go away anytime soon. According to Hannah Jones in her What is Owed article, it's irreparable. It's never going to go away.
So let me ask you something. As a scholar, as someone who for the past 40 so years of your career have taken what you do very seriously, citing citations, researching, extensive, exhaustive researching, just to get a doctorate, dissertations, everything. How do you look at something that comes out in the New York Times and is now being passed off as history, but even more so is being disseminated into our educational system? So 10 years from now, if we have this conversation, God forbid, we'd be talking about our grandchildren learning this fantasy world. How do you deal with something like that?
Well, personally, I think I have a certain amount of anger towards this misuse of the name of scholarship and history. More than angry, though, I'm alarmed. I'm of an age now where I'm concerned about what becomes of our country, and there are multiple reasons for that. But certainly the idea that we have striven so hard for all these centuries, really. The abolitionist movement was back before the revolution. We've tried so hard and with such great success to overcome racism in this country, and now to suddenly decide, oh, never mind, let's just embrace it. And that's really what the 1619 Project gives you, a kind of neo-racism, a willingness to say that every effort to get past racism has failed, it always will fail. Now what we can do is just spend the rest of our time atoning in shame. So if that's our future, it's a dismal future. It puts our country at risk. No country can succeed with the population divided against itself and viewing its past as a burden that just leaves us wallowing in guilt. So alarmed, I guess, is my biggest word for this. At my best moments, I look at what Hannah Nicole Jones and her fellow writers have done, and I'm a little bit amused that they can make such extraordinary claims on the basis of so little. There's a passage in my book, 1620, where I take notice that the Times actually created a new type font in order to print the 1619 project. There's a little hint there of how they see this. This is such a epoch-making break with all of history that it can't even be printed in the old type fonts like Times New Roman. It has to be printed in its own special type font. A kind of extraordinary pride is evidenced in this, or vanity, that what we're doing here is so new, so special, that every single piece of it has to be seen as a radical break with history. We're making it new, brand new from the get-go.
Okay, so you sit down, you're alarmed, you're angered. You write 1620, a critical response to the 1619 project. Your book on Amazon, 350 or so 5-star ratings. I did not read the whole book. I started leafing through it. I just couldn't believe you're responding to some of these silly accusations or some of these things that pass off as history, which wouldn't, if you back in the day, if you were in school and you mentioned something like this, you should fail. It's just totally wrong. So what is the average American supposed to do or think when they hear of the 1619 project? Because before you answer that, prior to our conversation, I figured it's a bunch of wackos, and it wasn't going to be, all right, so they're saying such silly things. Who's going to listen? Who's going to believe them? But you're scaring the heck out of me now. So what is the average American, the average listener to my podcast, how alarmed should they be?
I think I should be fairly alarmed. I think to gauge your alarm, or how much alarm you should have, you should check in with your local school district and see what's being taught. You might not get a straight answer from the school board or the superintendent. They now know that millions of Americans are really alarmed about what's happening, so they have been covering up a little bit. But if you just do a little bit poking around and see this, if this thing is there, it would help you make a sober judgment as to whether it's something you should fight about. Now, I want to be sort of fair-minded about all this. I know that having been through COVID, having been through the riots last year, with Black Lives Matter still complaining that our police are racist and promiscuously shooting black people, that there's a lot of tension in the country along the lines that African Americans have not been well treated and something needs to be done. And that eagerness to do something is, I think, open to some question, but nonetheless, it's good faith on people's part. They aren't intentionally making themselves party to a sham, but they are susceptible to the snake oil salesman who comes in and says, you got an ailment, I've got a cure, and here's the cure. Americans do like to delegate things to their experts. When it comes to our children, the experts are teachers. And if the teachers are susceptible to the snake oil salesman, a lot of parents are just going to shrug and say, okay, I mean, I was bored in grade school too. It doesn't matter what they teach. Kids will find their own way. We rationalize our ability not to pay attention to what kids are learning. But back in the day for the last several hundred years, what kids were learning was a basically factual history of where this country came from and why it matters. It matters because we're a nation that was founded in the pursuit of two cardinal values, liberty and equality. Liberty and equality don't always play well together. There's tensions between them, but nonetheless, those were our ideals, and we've gone mighty far to live up to those ideals. What kids used to learn in school, however well or however poorly, was that That's what we're about. That's what makes the United States a nation worth living in and worth defending. It also makes us the nation where immigrants from around the world want to come here. They want to be like us. They want to be part of this thing. So when we start teaching our youngest children, no, really, the past of America was nothing but mistakes and worse than mistakes. People were mean. They were nasty. They did terrible things to each other. And all the things you enjoy in life, they aren't really something you deserve. They're just things that come by means of the oppression done to other people, the meanness done to other people. Cultivate young kids in that attitude, you're going to end up with generations of kids who have nothing but disgust for their own country. Now, mind you, if you start telling an adult these sorts of stories, most adults will be skeptical. How do you know that? Where did that come from? What about? You can't expect a 7-year-old to have those answers for a teacher. The teacher says it's this way. It all started with slavery when the slaves were brought to Jamestown in 1619. Kids will grow up believing that. They will also believe, unfortunately, that slavery was something that was unique to America. Well, it's not. I mean, the Native Americans were enslaving each other for millennia before Europeans ever got here. Once the Spanish and the Portuguese had established a slave trade, they were bringing slaves not only to South America, the Caribbean, but to Florida and Georgia. So slavery had been in what was going to become the United States 100 years before Jamestown. There's lots of ways in which this story doesn't really add up. Slavery was nearly a universal human institution. America was one of the first places that said no and stopped it. Instead of telling that story, we're telling the story that America invented slavery and that this horrible institution is the result of choices that our founders made. Well, false in every conceivable way. That's false.
But how do they deal with the Bible, which talks about slavery and caring for a slave, and a Hebrew indentured servant serves 6 years, and the 7th year goes free, a Canaanite slave? All about that. How do they deal with that? And that's close to 3,000 years old.
You know, if you look through the 1619 project, you're not going to find much of anything in it about the Bible. So I would say they deal with that as they deal with other issues simply by ignoring them. There's an element of Marxism that's built into this thing. The 1619 project really sees the history of the country as one of material expropriation of people's labor, but it also treats American prosperity as having derived entirely from the plantation system. Northern capitalism and industry thrived because of Southern capital derived from slavery. American labor practices to this day are a form, I quote the term here, of a low-road capitalism that was the South system of trying to extract as much labor from an individual slave as possibly could, short of killing the person. That story of nasty, aggressive mistreatment of people in order to extract the best economic gain for the masters is the story that we're now teaching to young children.
All right, Dr. Wood, let me give you the last word here because you thoroughly depressed me. I was happy coming here this morning to do this podcast. Now I'm feeling terrible. I'm going to give you the last word on this, and I want you to make me happy, and I want you to make our listeners happy. This in the next, 3 to 5 years. How do you see this playing out?
Well, I think that we are two ways it's going to play out that might make you a bit optimistic. One is that nobody can long sustain the feeling of guilt without a sense of there being an end to it. So if you're asking the white population of America and everyone who's non-black to live in a perpetual shadow of misery over things that they can't change because they happened so long ago, you're asking for something that's impossible. people for a while can go along with this pretense that it's all about admitting our guilt. But after a while, they'll get tired of that and they'll shrug it off. The second thing is that Americans love our country. Americans of all races love our country. And a doctrine that's grounded in hatred of our country is eventually going to just grate to the point where people will reject it. So I think perhaps what we see in the 1619 Project is a bubble. We may have to endure this for a few more years, but at some point, Americans are going to say enough. I think that a fairly substantial number of Americans are already saying enough. I'm seeing on the basis of the talks that I give and the places I go, a kind of grassroots movement around the country where people are turning to their schools and say, what the devil are you doing? This is bad. Don't do it anymore. That's going to be a conflict point. I expect that you'll see this thoroughly politicized and fought out in Congress and in state legislatures, but we're also going to see it happening school district by school district all over the country. So I would take a fundamental optimism from the capacity of Americans to love their country enough to fight for it when they realize what's at stake.
Well, yeah, the fight is it's school board by school board. It's not the enemy outside; it's the enemy within. It's getting our children's minds. This is what Marxism did. This is what communism did. They start with the schools. They forget about the parents. Let's re-educate the kids, and they create a whole new world order.
Right, which of course fell apart, and as this one will as well. So
yeah, I really hope so. The name of the book is 1620: A Critical Response to the 1619 Project. Dr. Peter Wood, I wish you continued success. Keep fighting the fight. And for those who just basically want to do something, you suggest they don't have the education, they don't have the historical facts. What should they be doing? Calling their school boards, calling teachers, calling whom? What should they be doing?
I think talking to teachers, calling school boards is a very good step. If you don't personally feel confident enough to do that, you might start by just picking up a history book, not some big, complicated 800-page history book, but a short history of America, which will maybe remind you of things that you learned a long time ago and haven't thought about for years and years. But even if you've never encountered them before, a short history book would give you the opportunity to have that conversation that you ought to be having with your teachers. I titled my book 1620 for a reason. 1620 was the year in which the Pilgrims arrived off the coast of Massachusetts and signed the Mayflower Compact. It was basically an agreement to create a form of self-government, our first charter of self-government in the New World. If you know something about that, then you know that America has been struggling towards self-definition, a creation of a free, respectful, tolerant government from nearly the beginning. And that's something you can talk to your kids about. Once your kids understand that you care about history, they will care about it too. History has a reputation of being a dry and boring subject. That's because sometimes it's badly taught. But if you take an interest in it in yourself, you'll understand that it's full of just astonishingly good stories, which once you've learned them, you'll want to talk to other people about them.
Dr. Wood, for the average folk, what history book would you recommend getting?
No, I think there's a very good one right now by a historian named Bill McClay, and the idea here is to bring a simple sort of, the book is titled Land of Hope. It brings a simple, straightforward narrative of America's past within reach of anybody. If you can read Land of Hope. It's not hard.
Outstanding. And by the way, he's going to be a guest on our podcast. And I read it, and I thought it was fantastic. I learned so much, and it's very, very balanced. And that's coming from a layman, and I'm sure if you and we did not discuss this prior, so I'm really glad that I like something you liked.
Well, me too.
That's great. All right, Professor Wood, thank you so much. Fantastic. I wish you continued success, and keep fighting the good fight.
Well, thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Charles Mizrahi Show. If you're a new listener, welcome. If you've been listening for a while, we're glad to have you back. Either way, we'd love to know what you think of the show. Please leave a review if you listen on Apple Podcasts. Reviews make it easier for others to find the show. You can also see the video of the interview on the Charles Mizrahi Show channel on YouTube.